Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. In the year 1600, you step into Deptford with a smell of tar and wet rope thick in your nose, the air alive with the cries of dock workers and the creak of masts as ships nudge one another along the brown skin of the River Thames, where the tide drags in spices, wounded sailors, rumour and rot all at once. The narrow lanes behind the river are slick with mud, blood from the butcher's tables, and last night's ale, while shipwrights hammer oak into the bones of new vessels. Fishwives shout their wares with raw voices, and somewhere a preacher mutters of sin and salvation to men already half lost to the sea, so that everything feels restless, crowded, dangerous and alive, as if the whole place is breathing in hard and salty gulps. Christopher Marlowe lived fast, wrote brilliantly, and died violently. And in that brief, dangerous arc, he revealed the shadowed underbelly of Elizabethan England. This was an age of power, surveillance, religious terror, and secret informers. And Marlowe, the most gifted playwright of his generation, stood at the center of it all. Long before his suspicious death in a Deptford lodging house at just 29 years of age, whispers followed him everywhere that he worked as a government spy, that he moved in dangerous circles, that he toyed openly as an atheist, heresy and forbidden sexual ideas. Marlowe's meteoric rise was driven by a radical idea that thrilled audiences and terrified the state in equal measure. He was not just writing about power, treachery, and ambition. He was actually living inside those forces. The origins of that life are as impossible as his end. Marlowe was born in 1564, the same year as his great rival William Shakespeare, just a few months earlier in the cathedral city of Canterbury. But unlike Shakespeare, Marlowe's beginnings were starkly modest. His father was a shoemaker, a cobbler of no particular means, not even a native of the city itself. In 16th century England, men born into that world did not become literary revolutionaries, and they certainly didn't move in the secret networks of the Elizabethan intelligence service. Yet from the very start, Marlowe was already defying the gravity of his birth. Through scholarships, raw brilliance, and a succession of uncanny opportunities, he rose out of obscurity and into the dangerous orbit of state power. That rise, so sudden and so improbable, is one of the key clues that points towards his covert work as a government agent, moving between universities, foreign contacts, and political conspiracies, always watched, always useful, sadly, always expendable. By the time his life ended violently in Deptford, stabbed during what was officially described as a tavern dispute, Marlowe had already lived several lives at once: a celebrated playwright, a feared skeptic, a suspected atheist, and very likely a spy who knew far too much. And I think what really fascinates me about Christopher Marlowe is in the way he both abandons his origins and yet never truly escapes them. In one very real sense, he cuts himself cleanly away from the world he was born into. There's no gentle transition here. As the only son of a working shoemaker, the expectation was simple and absolute. He would take up his father's tools and his father's life. But instead, he vanishes into education, grammar school, then university, and with that step, he effectively severs the path laid out for him by birth. He never ever goes back. He never becomes what his father meant him to be. Yet, in another deeper sense, that background never stops haunting him. Even as he reinvents himself as a scholar and by degree and status a gentleman, the memory of having come from nothing stays lodged in his imagination. Again and again, in his plays, we meet characters who rise violently from obscurity, men driven by hunger, ambition, and resentment, men who claw their way upward and refuse to accept the limits imposed on them by birth. That fascination is personal. It's autobiographical. Marlowe never forgets where he began, even as he moves in circles his father could never have imagined. His education marks the real turning point, first at the King's School, Canterbury, and then on a prestigious scholarship to the University of Cambridge. Marlowe enters a world that is utterly sealed off from the one that he knew. This is not simply education in books, it's a social transformation. And for the first time in his life, this shoemaker's son finds himself living among the sons of earls and dukes and marquises. Class barriers that had once been immovable suddenly soften, at least within the walls of the university. Inside those walls, he is no longer defined by his father's trade, but by the sharpness of his mind. On paper, his path is respectable, even devout. He is being trained in theology, prepared for possible service to the Anglican Church. From the outside, it looks like the making of a country parson. Yet, everything in Marlowe's temperament pulls violently in the opposite direction, and this is one of the things that I love about him. Education, especially in the 16th century, does something dangerous. It brings together people who would never otherwise meet. It creates a contained world, all male, intense, intimate, and incredibly experimental. Teachers actually live among the students. Young men test ideas, loyalties, identities, desires. The walls of the university do not merely keep the outside world out, they create a pressure chamber within. And this particular moment in England is absolutely charged with fear. The 1570s and 1580s are decades still raw with religious terror. The nation has actually swung back and forth between Catholic and Protestant rule, and every swing has left bodies behind, interrogations, burnings, public executions. Faith is no longer a private matter. It's a death sentence waiting to be triggered. And into that volatile atmosphere steps Christopher Marlowe, brilliant, restless, and intellectually reckless. He's absorbing theology, yes, but also learning how dangerous ideas really are. And it's here, in this enclosed, fevered world of scholarship, power, and surveillance, that the first real shape of the man begins to form. Not just the playwright, no, but the man who will later move with suspicious ease through the shadow world of espionage. By the time Christopher Marlowe arrives at Cambridge in the 1570s, the place is anything but safe. From the outside, it looks like an ivory tower, but inside, it's actually charged with fear, with argument, and, of course, suspicion. Officially, the theology is that of the Church of England. Unofficially, the corridors whisper with heresies. On one side, you've got secret Catholics. On the other, radical Protestants who push doctrine to dangerous extremes. Even belief is being tested. Every word carries risk. Cambridge is a pressure chamber for forbidden ideas, and Marlowe walks straight into it. At Corpus Christi College, the first man to greet him is his tutor, a fellow named Kidd, who shows him to his rooms, explains the rhythms of college life, introduces him to the rules of this enclosed world. A few years later, that very same man will be arrested in Norfolk and burned alive for heresy. His crime is belief, or rather the wrong belief. He has come to argue that Jesus was a great man, but not divine, what we might now call a proto-Unitarian view. And in the late 16th century, that idea is a death sentence. And yet this is the intellectual atmosphere in which Marlowe is being formed. A world thick with unacceptable thoughts. A world in which young minds are encouraged to question everything, while knowing that beyond the college walls, such questioning can actually have you killed. Marlowe, to his credit, absorbs it all. Theology, philosophy, doubt, danger. He's marked early as a young man with a ferocious appetite for knowledge, and Cambridge gives him what looks like a safe space to test dangerous ideas. But it's only safe in appearance. Outside the walls waits the full brutality of the Elizabethan state. Inside, the seeds of rebellion are being planted daily. Then comes the moment that changes everything. After completing his bachelor's degree, Marlowe applies for further funding to proceed to a master's. He's accepted in principle. When the time comes to award the degree, the university suddenly blocks it. The reason, they say, is that he failed to meet the residency requirements. He has been absent for long stretches, far longer than the rules allow. Rumours circulate immediately that he has gone to France, to the English Catholic college that trains young dissidents for return missions into England, men whose purpose is infiltration, subversion, and potentially even the assassination of Queen Elizabeth I. On that basis, Cambridge refuses him his degree. Then, quite suddenly, everything reverses. A letter arrives, and this is no ordinary letter. It comes from the Privy Council itself, signed by the most powerful men in the kingdom. It states in unmistakable terms that Her Majesty would be greatly displeased if a man who has served the state as this young scholar has served were to be denied his degree. The meaning, of course, is unmistakable. The shoemaker's son is no longer merely a student. He is in service of the crown. And such letters are never written for nobodies, and they're certainly not written for children of cobblers. And I think this is actually the smoking gun. Marlowe has been recruited into the shadow world of intelligence, almost certainly by Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master, who runs England's Secret Service out of his London offices. What Marlowe was actually doing, the letter does not say. Espionage, of course, never explains itself. It only leaves fingerprints at the edges. And I think it's from that point on that certainty collapses into inference. Historians tread carefully here, but the pattern, I think, is very clear. He is missing when he should be present. He's protected when he should be punished. He's rewarded when he actually should have been disgraced. And this is how spies move through the world, half visible, half erased. And then, degree in hand, Marlowe emerges into London, a city of royal palaces and filthy alleyways, of country patronage and open prostitution, of plagues and playhouses. It's almost impossible for us to imagine the brutality of daily survival in this world. Epidemic disease alone would have terrified a modern population into collapse. Yet this is simply the air they breathe. Marlowe moves through this darkness with extraordinary ease. I think largely because he's connected to power, and he's also drawn to danger. And more importantly, he's writing with a fire that comes from having looked too closely at the machinery of the state and lived to tell the tale. So he's now many things at once: a celebrated playwright, a theological rebel, a state agent, and a man under constant watch. And in every word he writes from this point on, the life and the danger, the secrecy and the ambition pulse just beneath the surface of his plays. This is a world very much balanced on a knife edge. Ordinary life is dangerously unstable. Keep in mind, there's no street lighting, there's no organized police force as we would recognize it today, none of the bureaucratic safety nets we take for granted. Nightfall absolutely belongs to violence. Taverns spill drunken quarrels into alleyways. Theft, assault, and sudden death, all of it is commonplace. By our standards, simply surviving the streets of late 16th century London, it's an act of endurance, if anything else. And of course, the baseline misery of life is already pitched at a height that would terrify us today. But I think also layered on top of that is something far more insidious, a world with no freedom, no belief, no freedom of speech, no freedom of opinion. Spies sit quietly in inns and taverns listening. Words themselves are incredibly dangerous. A careless comment about religion, a loose remark about the crown, an unguarded opinion voiced over ale, and suddenly a man can vanish. The government is nervous, watchful, and at times legitimately paranoid. There are very real threats to Elizabeth I's regime. Catholic plots, foreign conspiracies, whispers of assassination. England lives in a permanent state of surveillance. And this is, of course, why young men from Oxford and Cambridge are being quietly recruited as government agents. They have language skills, they have mobility, they move easily between social worlds. And this is the world that Christopher Marlowe deliberately enters. Others don't. William Shakespeare doesn't become a spy. Many brilliant young men steer clear of that darkness, but not Marlowe. He steps straight into it with abandon. From the very beginning, he's associating with people who are exciting, who are brilliant, they're gifted, but they're also profoundly bloody dangerous. And yet, amid all of this, the extraordinary thing happens. Almost impossibly, he begins to write. And not just to write competently, but to write with a force that England has never heard before. He's barely in his early 20s, and he's just arrived in London from Cambridge, newly minted with his Master of the Arts, probably already carrying the bones of his first great play with him. I mean, this is astounding. I personally think that he'd been writing earlier while he was at Cambridge in collaboration with his fellow student Thomas Nash. And there is evidence to say that perhaps that happened, but we don't have definitive proof. But now, the machinery of the London theatre is ready for him. Public theatres began to rise along the city edges. They're desperate for material, and they must put 2,000 to 3,000 people in their yards every afternoon. They compete fiercely, they need sensation, and Marlowe delivers something no one has ever seen before. His play, Tamburlaine, crashes onto the London stage like artillery fire. It demands a great actor, and it finds one in Edward Allen, the first great star of the British theatre. Together, they change everything. For Tamburlaine, English drama is one thing. After all, it is something entirely new, and Marlowe effectively invents the sound of the English tragedy. The rolling, muscular thunder of blank verse becomes the dominant form of English drama for generations to come. This is the moment when the language itself seems to grow muscles. It's as radical a shift as going from silent film to sound. Suddenly the stage speaks with power and rhythm and fury, and it's all Marlowe. And while he's doing this, he's moving in the most rarefied and dangerous circles imaginable. He attracts the notice of figures such as Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Henry Percy, men of immense influence, intellectual daring, and political volatility. These become his patrons, his protectors, his gateways into power. And he's still barely more than a brilliant, reckless young man from Canterbury. So here he is, at once a government agent moving through the networks of surveillance and betrayal, a radical thinker steeped in forbidden ideas, and also the most electrifying playwright that England has yet produced. It's almost impossible to hold all these identities together in one life without something giving, something tearing. And yet, you know what? For a few blazing years, Marlowe does exactly that. Whether he understood at the time just how completely he has transformed English theatre, well, I think that might be doubtful. Genius rarely arrives with a trumpet fanfare for its owner, but everyone else can hear it. The arrival of Tamburlaine is a true rapture in the life of London's stage. It's not just a success, it's a conquest. Audiences are stunned into silence. Playhouses are transformed almost overnight. And Marlowe himself announces this revolution with breathtaking audacity. The play opens by sneering at everything that has gone before, dismissing the old jigging veins of clownish verse, and promising instead the stately sounds of war. It's a very cheeky, very arrogant, and utterly confident play. That tells you that this is a young man loudly declaring that the theatre is about to be remade in his own image. I was thinking that it must have infuriated many of his contemporaries, and of course it does. Envy follows him immediately. And of course, envy is very good friends with resentment. That's predictable. But I think what's far more interesting is what happens next. One particular contemporary hears something deeper in Marlowe's thunder, something transformative, and recognizes its power instantly. And of course, that man is William Shakespeare. What follows between them is not merely rivalry in the vulgar sense, it's a tension of the most intense kind. Shakespeare watches Marlowe with extraordinary care. He listens, he learns from him, and he absorbs everything he says, and then he answers. So Marlowe writes Tamburlaine. Shakespeare responds almost immediately with Henry VI. Marlowe writes The Jew of Malta. Shakespeare answers with The Merchant of Venice. Marlowe writes Edward II. Shakespeare follows with Richard II. And these are not accidents. These are the acts of close attention, of admiration, of emulation, and of competition. Shakespeare is not merely copying. That's beyond him. Others try to imitate Marlowe directly, and they fail spectacularly. His voice is too singular, too dangerous, too charged to be easily replicated. Shakespeare takes the underlying force of what Marlowe has done and teaches himself how to bend it into something even more psychologically complex, more flexible, and I think much more durable. And yet, the relationship between them is not one of friendship. Far from it. I don't think that they were ever companions in any warm sense. Marlowe is by every indication a dangerous man to know. Shakespeare sees this, and he's cautious. He's observant, he's shrewd, and of course he recognizes the genius, but also the volatility. He keeps his distance. You can hear him teasing Marlowe in later plays, parodying the thunder of Tamburlaine through the bombastic figures like Pistol in Henry V. But beneath the mockery lies unmistakable admiration. Shakespeare takes what Marlowe has unlocked and pushes it further than anyone else ever will. Without Marlowe, Shakespeare is unimaginable. And of course, without Shakespeare, Marlowe would still be revolutionary, but his revolution would have died young with him. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. All of this unfolds inside a social world that is baited with traps. This is a culture of entrapment. Men lure one another into confession, into heresy, into indiscretion, and then they spring the net. Loyalty, I think, in this age is brittle. Conversation itself is a weapon, and we only glimpse parts of Marlowe's inner circle. But what we do see, I find absolutely chilling. Figures like Robert Poley move through his world, men who are charming, plausible, agreeable, even delightful company, but who are also professional manipulators, trained to extract information and destroy lives without hesitation. Marlowe, to his credit, moves among such men as both participant and target. He's brilliant company. He's funny, he's dazzling, he's provocative. And he's also walking straight into a culture where people are set up to fall. Some of those closest to him will pay terrible prices. Others will turn out to have been watching him all along. He stands always on the edge of friendship and betrayal, never quite knowing which he is being offered on that silver tray. And still, he writes. Play after incendiary play, each one bolder in its politics, darker in its psychology, more dangerous in its theology. Fame cannot but follow him. And of course, with fame comes patronage. But so too does something colder and far more patient: surveillance, files, watchful eyes. This is the cost of brilliance in a world that does not forgive deviation. Perhaps we prefer to imagine that Marlowe was somehow almost magically innocent of all of this, that he was merely a courier carrying letters as a harmless envoy for the spy service. But it's very unlikely that this was the only way in which he was being used. It strains belief that a man could move for years inside such a poisoned world and remain completely untouched by it. I think the people around him were not merely colorful or controversial. I think they were terrifying. These were men implicated in conspiracies like the Babington plot, the architects of the trap that destroyed Mary, Queen of Scots, professional deceivers who were planted inside prisons to befriend inmates only to betray them to the state. I'm not saying that Marlowe himself carried out these acts, but he moved among those who did, for sure. And it's almost inconceivable that he was actually not himself in. But he certainly moved among those who did, and it's hard to conceive that he wasn't also part of that particular game. If we then accept that he's entangled in this shadow world, then the leap into drama feels really not much like speculation at all, but more like a confession. His plays are saturated with people who make terrible bargains, who trade safely for power, who step knowingly into moral darkness because they believe the rewards are worth it. From the thunder of Tamburlaine to the ruthless calculation of the Jew of Malta, Marlowe is obsessed with men who know the world is dangerous and choose to exploit that danger rather than flee from it. These are not distant philosophical exercises. They feel intimate, lived. The terror is very precise. And nowhere is this more personal, more naked, I think, than in Dr. Faustus. This is not merely a morality play about sin. This is the drama of a man who makes a conscious pact, fully understanding the cost. Faustus does not stumble into damnation. He negotiates it. He enjoys the privileges of his bargain while knowing every moment that the reckoning is tightening around his neck. It's impossible not to hear Marlowe himself inside that voice. A man actually asking, how far can I go? What am I willing to trade? What will the price finally be? By the late 1580s, he is moving forward through a life built on precisely these kind of agreements. Decisions that promote freedom, that promote status and influence now, but which trail consequences behind them like long, dark shadows. And yet, these are also the brightest years of his life. For all the darkness, Marlowe is not merely surviving, he's actually flourishing. Instead of a lifetime bent over a cobbler's bench, he is living among extraordinary minds and extraordinary power. And I think most striking of all is his entry into the dazzling intellectual world surrounding Sir Walter Raleigh. This is a circle of explorers, scientists, mathematicians, free thinkers, philosophers, all intoxicated by new discovery. The world itself seems to be tearing itself open. New continents across the ocean, new stars in the heavens, new ideas about God, authority, and the human mind. Everything once thought fixed is suddenly in flowing motion. For Marlowe, it must have been electric. He moves through this world not as an observer, but as a participant, absorbing it all at full voltage, questioning everything: religion, politics, destiny, the hierarchy of the universe itself. And this intellectual rebellion, I think, nourishes his art. The plays blaze with it. So do his poems. They crackle with the sense that the old certainties are dying and nothing solid has yet replaced them. And at the same time, there is another life unfolding in parallel, far more dangerous because it must remain so carefully hidden. Marlowe's work and scattered testimony actually make it strikingly clear that he is homosexual. in a world where that fact alone could completely destroy him. He comes closer to acknowledging it openly than any other man alive in the 16th century, and it's daring. It's there in the language of his poetry, in the emotional charge of his relationships, in the dangerous intimacy of his friendships. Every personal attachment carries risk. Every desire must be disguised. And yet, he doesn't retreat into caution. He actually leans forward into experience with the same fearlessness that defines his intellect. So these middle years of Marlowe's life burn with contradiction. And I think also exhilaration, I think definitely espionage, and of course philosophy. There's also surveillance and sensuality. Secret service to the crown and secret rebellion against God. He's living faster than anyone around him. And that kind of speed always carries at a cost. Sadly, none of Marlowe's personal letters survive. There is no private correspondence to guide us through his inner life. What we have instead are his astounding plays, especially the latter ones, the icy intelligence of Dr. Faustus, the ruthless clarity of the later works, and then, chillingly, the official records, the language of spies, the language of accusation, the language of the state. By the early 1590s, reports begin to circulate that Marlowe is saying things no one says if they wish to live. That Jesus and St. John were lovers, that Christ was actually guilty of the sin of Sodom. If he said these things, and there is strong reason to believe that he did, they are not casual provocations, they are lethal statements. In Elizabethan England, this is not intellectual rebellion, it's actually a death wish. These are the words of a man testing the outer limits of what it's possible to say and may be possible to survive. And I think they come from a life in which Marlowe has grown accustomed to danger, in which he has normalized this risk, in which even belief itself has become something to gamble with. By 1593, he has been in London for close to a decade of feverish creativity, a decade of radical friendships, a decade of espionage, speculation, surveillance, and then the ground suddenly shifts beneath his feet. It had to. That spring, London is in absolute misery. There's bad weather, there are failed crops, there's rising food prices, and soaring rents. And the city is actually raw with resentment, looking for someone to blame. Anti-immigrant feelings surge. And one night, a threatening poem is nailed to a wall of the Dutch church in London, the place of worship for Protestant refugees from German-speaking lands. The poem is vicious. It accuses foreigners of stealing livelihoods, of driving up rents, of poisoning the city. It threatens violence, and it's signed with a single incendiary name, Tamburlaine. And of course, the authorities react immediately. The Privy Council offers a handsome reward for the identity of the author. Searches begin. Marlowe himself can't be found. He's already left London. But they do find his former roommate, the playwright Thomas Kidd, and they search Kidd's room, but they find no evidence tying him to the threatening poem. But what they do find is something far worse, a heretical document denying the divinity of Christ. Kidd, of course, insists the paper is not his. He says the handwriting is not his. He says that he doesn't know why it's in his possession. But it doesn't matter. He's taken to prison, he's tortured, and under torture, he suddenly remembers that the document belongs to Christopher Marlowe. He begins to repeat the rumors, the blasphemers' remarks, the dangerous opinions. Marlowe's name is now formally attached to heresy. Almost simultaneously, another spy report is filed repeating similar accusations. It's now unmistakable. The state is paying very close attention to what Marlowe has been saying. And of course, at this moment, Marlowe's not in London. He's in the countryside of Kent. He's staying at the most beautiful moated house owned by Thomas Walsingham, the wealthy relative of the spy master who first recruited him into the government service. And I think by all accounts, this may have been one of the happiest interludes of Marlowe's life. If you can imagine it, the air is clean, the gardens are quiet. He is writing one of the most delicate and luminous poems of the age. He's safe for the moment. He may even be in love. For a brief pause, the noise of London, the theatre, the spies, the taverns, the jealousies, they all fall away. And of course, then comes the inevitable knock at the door. A government officer arrives with a warrant for his arrest. The refuge collapses. The protection evaporates. The game he has been playing for years finally turns on him. Marlowe is taken into custody and ordered to present himself daily before authorities. He's not yet imprisoned, but he's no longer free. From this moment on, the descent is relentless. The shadows that he lives in for decades now close in on all sides, and every path leading forward bends with dreadful precision towards Deptford. They bring Marlowe back to London to be questioned, but they don't imprison him. He's left in this strange legal twilight. He's under arrest, yet he's not confined. He can't leave the area of the court, yet he's not told fully what he's accused of. It all has the eerie logic of the trial. A man caught inside the process he doesn't understand, watched, constrained, suspended in uncertainty, if you like, while the machinery of the state quietly gathers evidence against him. What the surviving documents reveal is only this. The government is now actively collecting reports on Marlowe's dangerous opinions, and you would have to surmise that his words, his plays, have finally caught up with him. And then, while still technically under arrest, he's invited out for the day by a friend, or perhaps more accurately by an acquaintance, a man named Ingram Frizzer. The destination? Deptford. There, Marlowe meets three men he already knows. Frizzer himself, Nicholas Skeers, and most unsettling of all, Robert Poley. They all gather at the house of a widow known as Eleanor Bull. What follows is not a casual visit. It's an entire day. They eat lunch together. They linger through the afternoon. They dine together in the early evening. Hours and hours pass, and no one in the house later reports hearing what they discussed, only that after dinner, voices suddenly rise, shouting is heard, there was a struggle, and then there was silence. And of course, when the others rush into the room, Christopher Marlowe is lying on the floor bleeding to death. A knife has entered directly through his eye into his brain. He's 29 years old. For centuries, that has been the end of the official story. Then in the 1920s, an astonishing discovery is made. A young scholar uncovers the long-lost inquest report into Marlowe's death, misfiled for more than 300 years. And it records the testimony of the three surviving men in the room. According to them, the killing occurred during a quarrel over the reckoning, the bill for the day's food and drink. Marlowe, they say, disputed the cost, seized a knife, and in the ensuing struggle was accidentally stabbed through the eye. But the trouble with this account is not merely its convenience. The real problem is the men who tell it. All three are deeply connected to the Elizabethan intelligence network. All three are professional manipulators. And the most notorious among them, Robert Poley, is not just any agent. He is the same man who infiltrated the circle of Anthony Babington and urged him to contact Mary, Queen of Scots, a move that ultimately led to her execution. These are not men who drift into fatal tavern squabbles by accident. And I think, set against the backdrop of fresh spy reports accusing Marlowe of blasphemy, of dangerous speech, of heretical thought, including a chilling official remark that his mouth should be stopped, the idea that his death was caused by nothing more than an argument for a bill strains belief almost beyond breaking point. So who gave the order, if the order was given at all? Whose interests were truly being served? These questions have never been answered, and my own sense is that the decision, if there was one, came from the highest levels. That Marlowe, once useful to the state, had become inconvenient. That his brilliance, his recklessness, his dangerous tongue now made him a liability. And liabilities in this world, well, they're removed quietly. What became of the men who survived him only deepens my unease. Ingram Fraser goes on to become the trusted financial manager of Thomas Walsingham. Nicholas Skeers fades into the historical shadows. He basically disappears. And Robert Poley, the most chilling figure of all, lives on in wealth and safety. No punishment, no suspicion that sticks. Legally, all of them are resolved as innocence, that the attack was self-defense. And I think that too feels sanctioned. Even William Shakespeare appears to hint that something is wrong. In his play, As You Like It, he writes a strange, haunting line about a man being more dead for a great reckoning in a little room where a man's verses are not understood. And it's hard not to hear an echo of Deptford in that sentence. An argument, a reckoning, a small room, poets silenced. And so we're left with fragments, spy reports, legal documents, competing testimonies, silences that speak as loudly as any confession. Christopher Marlowe's life ends in darkness, cut short at the very moment when his powers, I think, were at their absolute height. Yet I also feel that what he leaves behind is seismic. In less than a decade, he utterly reshaped the sound of English drama. He forged the language that William Shakespeare would go on to perfect. He placed ambition, power, faith, damnation, and desire at the center of the English stage. He lived as recklessly as he wrote. He made dangerous bargains. He stared into forbidden ideas without flinching. I sometimes think Marlowe actually sensed the truth far earlier than most of us ever dare to think. That he understood instinctively that he was walking along the very lip of the abyss, that some agreement had been made with the state, with power, perhaps metaphorically with something much darker, from which there would be no safe escape. And perhaps he simply accepted that condition. After all, he might have thought, we're walking on a precipice. The only difference is that most of us do it timidly. Marlowe actually did it at speed. He was certainly not an actor like Shakespeare, not a player in the literal sense, but he was the greatest player of all the imagination. He allowed his mind to go where others feared to look, places they were not permitted to go, places they did not permit themselves to go. He took chances, enormous chances, and those chances somehow, unbelievably poured out of a man still in his 20s in a succession of masterpieces. In a handful of explosive years, I think he carried us to the steppes of Central Asia with Tamburlaine. He dragged us into this brutal trading world of Malta with its Jews, Muslims, and Christians locked in endless conflict. He dared to put a homosexual king at the center of English history on stage. And I think most famously of all, he took us into the study of a man who knowingly makes a bargain with the devil. Just think about that. Think about what that means. If Shakespeare had died at 29, we would have almost nothing. But Marlowe, in his brief, incandescent life, leaves behind a blaze of creation so intense that it still lights the stage 4 centuries later. This rush of imaginative fire, this reckless generosity of genius, came from a man living as though time itself was short. Did he believe he would pay the price in blood? Well, we'll never know. Perhaps he thought he would go on. Perhaps he thought, like Faustus, that the reckoning could always be delayed just a little bit longer. But what he did achieve, I think, is unmistakable. In less than a decade, he tore open the imaginative world of Elizabethan England. And here, I think, is the final miracle. It's not only the theatre that is transformed by Marlowe, it's the whole inner life of the nation. England was a country hemmed in by fear, fear of God, fear of heresy, fear of the state, fear of desire, fear of the imagination itself. Marlowe smashes that wall. He blasts a crack clean through it. And I think through that crack walks Shakespeare. And through Shakespeare, the entire modern dramatic imagination follows. Marlowe, to me, doesn't simply rival Shakespeare. He makes Shakespeare possible. You know, to break a wall that thick requires a life lived at full risk, a life like Marlowe's. You know, it was dangerous, it was brilliant, it was unrepeatable. It was a life that burned itself out in a small room in Deptford over a reckoning that was never really about the bill. He dies at 29, but the world he opened never closes again. And that was his price. And I think also that is the victory. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Christopher Marlowe. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Bye for now.